Directing a live broadcast is not easy. I remember my first time doing it. I walked into a setup of 3 cameras, all sitting on tripods, barely moving at all, having watched so many videos about how to direct a live stream. But all of a sudden, as soon as I was in that moment, I was stressed out. I had thought I was prepared, but as soon as I experienced the tiniest version of the real thing, everything started coming at me a million miles an hour. I had a hard time listening to the music, but also thinking about what I was doing. My fingers felt lost on the switcher. Was I switching too fast? Was I switching too slow? Was I going to the beat of the song? It was a lot. What up? I'm Josh from Budget Church Live Streaming. If all of that sounds like you, don't worry, you're not alone. Everybody struggles with directing when they first do it, and that's why I'm making this video, to show you kind of a rundown and the tips and tricks that I wish I knew my first time directing. First off, let's talk about what a live stream director actually is and what they do. Now, if you're at a large church that has been live streaming for a while, that probably looks a lot different than a smaller church. But also, if you're in that position, you're probably not really needing this video, so I'm going to focus on the other end of the spectrum. People who are probably doing a lot of things on a Sunday morning as the live stream director. Usually, you're going to be the one who's completely in charge of the live stream. You're calling the shots. Literally, you're going to be switching cameras. You're also going to be the one making sure all your cameras are in focus and that their color and exposure levels match, and probably keeping up with the technical side of things, checking your bit rate, checking if YouTube is still up and running. It's a lot of responsibilities all rolled into one. But perhaps the biggest responsibility of them all is actually telling a story to the people watching from home. You're responsible for an hour and a half, or however long your services are, for transporting a viewer from their living room or their car or wherever to the sanctuary with the rest of the church body in order to worship. If that sounds like a huge responsibility, way too much for one person, you're kind of right, it is. That's why I'm making this video though, to help give you the tools and get rid of the nerves so that you can serve the kingdom in a better and more confident way. I won't be diving into super specific technical things because that's going to depend a lot on the church you're at and the equipment that you have. Instead, I'm going to focus on higher level directing tips that you can apply no matter where you are or what gear that you have. Most of these tips are going to be focused on the worship portion of a service because, let's be honest, that's the part that most of us struggle with. It moves faster and it's a little bit more nuanced than the speaking portions. Don't worry, I still have a couple of tips for those too, but just know that we're going to be focusing on the former. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first tip that I have is to make sure that you know the structure of your service before it's time for the service. So much of what you do as a director is responding to what's happening in the room and what's coming next. And so if you already know what's coming next, you'll be able to respond a lot better because you won't be making it up on the fly. If your church uses Planning Center or some other type of service planning software, make sure you're looking at that in the days leading up to the service. If you have questions about it, ask your pastor or whoever else is in charge of making that schedule to make sure that you understand the full flow of things and how that's going to affect the live stream and your job as the director. It can also help to make sure your camera operators are doing the same thing and then running through it with them the morning of, just to make sure you're all on the same page. The fewer surprises that your team has just from the normal schedule, the better you'll be able to adapt and respond to the actual surprises that are bound to come up on a Sunday morning. In a similar way, make sure you're also learning the songs that you're going to be doing in the service. I know, you're not part of the band, but as the production team, you contribute just as much to the overall worship experience as the band does. If you don't know the songs and you take a shot of a guitarist who's not playing or a vocalist who's picking their nose, that's just as distracting to somebody worshiping from home as if the pianist accidentally hit a sour note. We are helping to lead people to the throne of God to worship, and we need to make sure that we're doing our best at that. And if we're not preparing, we're not doing our best. Full stop. I don't want to harp on this too much, but I do want to make sure that the importance of it truly sinks in. I think learning and knowing the songs is one of the most important things that you can do as a live stream director, and that will do more than anything else to take your live stream to the next level. Plus, if you know the songs well, it'll make following the rest of these tips a whole lot easier. For example, we want to make sure that we're making our cuts along to the beat and rhythm of the song. Whether people consciously notice it or not, we're all aware of noticing when two things are off rhythm with each other. So if you're making visual cuts off beat from the audible cuts that they're hearing, it'll feel a little bit jarring and just honestly not great. Now, I'm not saying you need to cut every measure perfectly on beat with the song and never deviate from that. Some shots will be held longer and some will be quick cutaways to something. Just make sure that as you're switching, you're doing it in time with the band. Sometimes to make sure that I'm keeping up with the beat of the song, I like to stand, and that way I can get my whole body into things or start tapping my foot along with it. I personally find that it's a little bit easier to get into the music if I'm standing versus sitting, but find something that works for you and kind of helps you along with that. As you're doing that, make sure that you're showing people the things that they're hearing. For example, if there is a single vocalist leading the song, make sure you have a lot of shots of them and not necessarily of the other vocalists that are just providing background. If there's a cool guitar riff happening, cut to a shot of that, not of the bassist who's not actually playing in the moment. If the song starts to speed up and things are kind of building and getting bigger, make your cuts start happening faster and faster to kind of keep up with the pacing of the music. Likewise, if the song slows down, slow down your cuts, pull out wide, show the room, make something feel big and waiting in those moments. It'll really help connect the visual to the audible and help somebody feel a lot more connected to that moment. Whether you're cutting quickly or you're cutting slowly based on the song, try to make sure you're not going back and forth between the same two angles too often, or between two angles that look way too similar. I know that this can be hard for those of us who only have a couple of different cameras and they might be stationary on tripods. But I promise you, if things get a little too repetitive, people will get bored and they'll start to zone out, and we definitely don't want that. So I'd encourage you, if you only have two cameras, make sure in between each shot, you're moving one of them so that it's a different shot the next time you cut to it. You don't want to get in too much of a pattern, so try to mix things up a little bit, but doing that will make a huge difference and really add a lot of variety and flavor to your live stream. My next tip is to make sure that you're communicating well with your camera ops. Hopefully, if you're sitting in the director's chair, you've operated a camera before too, and so you know that it can be a little bit isolating. They don't see the multi-view, they don't see the program feed, and they're definitely not inside your head, so it can be a little bit hard for them to keep track of everything that's going on. So it's your job as the director to tell them and communicate that with them. Make sure they know when they're live or when they're coming up. Do this verbally, always, and sometimes visually if you're using something like tally lights. By the way, if you want to know how to make some cool DIY tally lights, check out the video on the channel, I'll link it up here. Don't be afraid to ask your camera ops for the shot you need. Like I said, they can't see your multi-view, so they don't know the other shots that you have or what you're currently looking at or how you're going to build things. So sometimes, even though they might have a good shot, it's not actually the shot that fits in the story the best. The better that you both know the songs and each other's styles, the more you'll be able to predict that a little bit, but you're never going to be perfect. Sometimes you just need a shot that nobody has, and that's okay. At the end of the day, it's your job as the director to tell the story, and so sometimes you just need to have others help you. Another tip for communicating is to use camera numbers instead of people's names to refer to your camera ops. I know, it can seem a little bit dehumanizing to refer to people as a number instead of their name, but I promise, in the heat of the moment when you're cutting quickly, it's so much easier to just say 3's live, 4's live, than it is to be Joseph, Joel, Josh, Joe. I promise it'll make a huge difference, and honestly, people really won't mind that much. Just make sure you don't refer to them as numbers when you see them at Bible study later that week. Speaking of numbers, help me boost the numbers on this video by giving it a like or hitting the subscribe button if you're liking it. Make sure you don't miss any upcoming videos. So I mentioned the multi-view before. For people who are new at directing, that big screen with all those different camera angles and your preview and program and whatever else can be a little bit overwhelming and kind of distracting in the moment. It can be really easy to want to look back and forth between the multi-view and the program feed and the multi-view and the program feed just to make sure that what you're cutting is actually going to the right place. So the next tip is trust your switcher. You know that when you're cutting something, it's going to the program feed. You don't have to check to make sure it's there. And the less that your eyes are moving back and forth, up and down, the easier it is to be able to focus on your cameras and what they're doing and think about what you're doing next. This is personally a hard one for me, but once I kind of broke that habit, things became a lot easier for me when I was switching. Along those same lines, it's super helpful if your different cameras are only getting shots of very specific things. For example, in our room, camera 1 is always going to have a shot of the lead vocalist. It might be tight, it might be a little bit wider, but I always know that the lead vocalist is going to be on that camera. Or another example, camera 3. They're focused on the drums and the bass guitarist, and ever so often a shot of the front line from behind them. This can make it a lot easier in the fast moments to know how to build with the band. If I hear the drums starting to build, I know that camera 3 is going to be the one that has a shot of them. If I know the songs, and my camera ops know the songs, and we trust each other, then I can be pretty sure that they're going to have a shot of the drums. Obviously, I still need to look at the multi-view and make sure that they have a good shot, but this means I'm not looking at cameras 1 through 4 and hoping that one of them has a shot of the drums. I know exactly where I'm looking, and I'm expecting to see something. Plus, the more that you serve with the same group of people, the more you learn each other's habits and the easier it will be to predict what they're going to have a shot of at any given time. This will cut down tremendously on your mental load when you're directing and really just make things a lot easier. I remember seeing a social media post recently, I think it was Chad Vegas. Their multi-view went out during an entire song, but instead of freaking out or not cutting at all, he was able to direct the entire song without seeing any of the cameras because he knew what each camera was going to be capturing and he trusted his camera ops to be getting a good shot of that thing. Obviously, I'm not expecting everyone to be at that level, but that's the kind of benefit that you can get if your cameras are very specific in what they're capturing. Okay, I know that was a lot of worship, so now we're going to go into a couple of tips for the speaking portions. Like I mentioned before, they're a lot simpler, and so there's not really a lot that you have to worry about. For example, when we go to our speaking portions, we actually only use 2 out of our 4 cameras, which cuts down on things a lot. Anyone can realistically direct during a sermon, but there's definitely things that you can do to take it to the next level and make things a little bit easier on the eyes. First off, you'll want to make sure you're cutting a lot more slowly. But you also don't want to be cutting too slow because that's going to get really boring. There's no hard and fast rule here, and a lot of it will depend on your particular church and kind of the pacing of the sermons. But for ours, I try to stay on each shot for anywhere from 30 to 60 seconds. That can sometimes seem like an eternity if you're just waiting to push the button, so it's really more of just like a feeling than anything else. I like to time my cuts with natural transitions, such as the end of a sentence or when the pastor looks up and starts to kind of walk towards the other side of the stage. You don't always get opportunities like that though, so sometimes you really just need to make a cut when you need it. If things are feeling boring for you, they're probably feeling boring for the person at home, so it's time to make a cut. Try your best to cut to cameras that the pastor is looking at. Obviously, don't do this if he's constantly looking around to different parts of the auditorium over and over again. People will get dizzy at home and it will not be a good time. But if he's making a big point and he's looking at a very particular part of the sanctuary and you happen to have a camera there, go ahead and cut to it. It will help drive that point home a lot better for the people watching at home and make it feel like he's talking directly to them. This is another great opportunity for tally lights if your pastor is good at speaking towards a camera and that's something that he wants to prioritize. You can show him what camera is live with a tally light up on the front of it, and he can speak directly to that camera in order to address the people at home. And finally, I would just say try to prioritize your tighter shots during the sermon. Wide shots are nice, and they can give a shot of the entire room and kind of some context for what's going on, as well as give some breathing space. But overall, the whole room isn't that interesting during the speaking portion because everyone's just kind of sitting there watching. So I would stick with the tighter shots more often. I know that was a lot, and realistically, even with all these tips, you're still going to make mistakes. You'll accidentally cut to camera 2 when you meant to go to camera 3, or you'll get a close-up of somebody as they're picking their nose. Look, it happens to all of us. In those moments, try not to stress out too much. Nobody's taking this as seriously as you are, and nobody's going to notice those mistakes as much as you do. That's not to say we want to make more mistakes, just try not to focus on them. Just cut away from that moment quickly, don't linger on it, and move on. We're never going to be perfect, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for excellence. And in the spirit of excellence, here's 2 more tips. First of all, practice. Look, you're never going to get better if all you do is watch videos and try to learn, but don't actually put those things into practice in the real world. And if the only time you get to practice is during that one set on Sunday morning, it's going to take you a long time to improve. If your band does rehearsals either during the week or before church on Sunday, try to make sure you're there for that, and try to make sure your camera ops are there too. Run a full rehearsal with them. Learn what it's like to work with your team and with your band to put these tips into practice and continue growing. The more you work together at things, the more comfortable you'll become with each other and with the gear that you use, and the more space you have to experiment and get creative and just perform well. And secondly, watch other live streams. Learn from other people. They may not be in the same style that you're shooting for, but there are always things that you can glean from what other people are doing. More than that, some churches like Bethel actually stream their production multi-view, so you can get an inside look at how their director and their camera ops actually broadcast the service. This is a way that I learned a ton, and I know that you will too. Specifically Bethel, they'll actually answer questions that you ask during the chat as they're going throughout the live stream, so it's an awesome place to learn and hone your craft. Look, these tips are not the end all be all, but if you really take them to heart and practice them, you will get better. I promise, after putting some of these into practice, take a look at some of your older live streams and see the advancements you've made. They may be incremental, but I promise they're there. And remember, we're not improving just for the sake of improving, or even for the sake of bragging about how good our live stream is. We're doing it for God's glory and to help people draw near to Him in worship, and I think that's worth it. Until next time.